Autumn descended on eastern Colorado early in 1886. Cold winds swept across Coyote Draw Ridge, carrying the chilling patience of something that knew it would remain long after humanity had turned to dust. That was where Keturah Hale arrived during the darkest chapter of her life. The previous winter, a vicious fever had claimed her husband. By spring, the prosperous farm they had built together was gone. Amos Hale, her ruthless brother-in-law, had seen to that, scheming to strip her of everything. He kept the livestock, the tools, the fertile fields. He took it all. Keturah was cast out with nothing but a battered wagon, a few blankets, some cast-iron pots, and whatever clothes she could cram into a cedar chest. No money, no hope. Her sole remaining asset was 27 barren acres left to her by her late grandmother. The county folks called that lonely hill the Dead Rise, and it had earned its grim moniker. The soil was pale, choked with alkali salts. It baked as hard as fired brick in the summer sun, fracturing into fissures wide enough to swallow a man's boot. For 2 solid decades, not a single living thing had taken root long enough to yield a worthwhile crop. Everyone was dead certain. Nature had long ago delivered its death sentence on this ridge. Yet, on a bitter October dawn, Keturah appeared on that dead land carrying a sack of winter rye, a shovel, and a bundle of wooden stakes. Instead of plowing herself to the bone or scattering seed on a prayer, she set to work driving those stakes into the unyielding earth in a bizarre, seemingly senseless pattern. Amos rode out to mock her. "Your grandmother died dirt poor on this very land," he scoffed. "If it was worth a damn, why wasn't she rich?" Within days, the townspeople began sarcastically calling the place the widow's grave. Keturah heard the whispers, but she ignored them, driving every hammer blow deep into the hardened dirt. The prairie wind might have carried away their laughter, but the stakes remained. Everyone assumed the widow had lost her mind, but the truth was, this ridge was hiding a secret beneath its pale crust. The stakes were not random. That was the first thing nobody understood. While clearing dry prairie grass from the ridge, Keturah kept noticing something she had seen the previous winter. Certain narrow strips across the hillside held snow longer than the surrounding ground. Not by weeks, sometimes only by a few days, but long enough to matter. Most people would never have paid attention. She did. When spring thaw came, those same strips stayed damp, after the rest of the ridge had already dried and hardened. One afternoon, she carried a shovel to the first marked section and dug down through the pale crust. The top layer looked exactly as people described it, white, bitter with alkali, lifeless. But several inches below, the color changed. Not black, not rich, yet darker, cooler. Holding moisture, Keturah crouched beside the hole for a long time, breaking the soil apart with her fingers. The next morning she dug another, then another. Every time she found the darker layer, she drove a wooden stake into the ground beside it. Soon, a strange pattern began appearing across the ridge, a line of markers running where nobody expected them. Travelers passing along the county road assumed she was measuring property boundaries. Others thought she was searching for stone. Neither explanation was correct. Keturah was searching for something hidden beneath the surface, something the wind, the snow, and the seasons had been trying to reveal for years. For the first time since arriving at the Dead Rise, a small possibility began taking shape. Perhaps the land was not dead at all. Perhaps it had simply never been understood. A week later, Keturah rode into town and stopped at the small church near the cottonwoods along Dry Creek. Inside, Reverend Abigail Finch, the woman who kept the church records and much of the county's forgotten history, listened patiently while Keturah described the ridge. Abigail disappeared into a storage room and returned carrying a weathered ledger wrapped in cloth. The notebook had belonged to Nathaniel Crow, a frontier agronomist who had died nearly 20 years earlier. Its pages were filled with observations. Alkali soils, winter rye, freeze-heave fissures, moisture seams hidden beneath barren ground. That evening, under the glow of an oil lamp, Keturah began copying the faded entries by hand. Somewhere inside those worn pages, she suspected, lay an answer the ridge had been hiding for decades. The notebook did not describe miracles. Nathaniel Crow distrusted miracles. What he described were patterns. Again and again, his entries returned to the same conclusion. The land people called dead was rarely dead. Most often, only the surface had failed. Beneath the white alkali crust, narrow seams of moisture still traveled through the soil. Winter winds pushed snow into predictable drifts. Spring thaw opened hidden fractures. Water followed those fractures downward. Crow believed winter rye possessed one advantage many crops lacked. Its roots were patient. Given the right place and the right season, they would follow moisture where other plants could not. But location mattered, timing mattered. Miss either one, and the crop would fail. Keturah carried the notebook everywhere after that. Each morning she walked the ridge before sunrise. Each afternoon, she returned. She compared snow lines, cracks in the soil, and damp patches against Crow's notes. Slowly, the scattered stakes across the dead rise began to form a pattern. For the first time, the ridge no longer looked abandoned. It looked misunderstood. By November, most people had stopped trying to guess what Keturah Hale was doing. They simply decided she had lost her senses. The ridge looked less like a farm every week. Instead of plowing, she measured. Instead of planting, she walked. Instead of buying livestock, she carried a steel probe from one end of the property to the other. For nearly 2 months, she divided the 27 acres into rough sections. Each section was marked with stakes and numbered in a small notebook she kept tucked inside her coat. At every location, she pushed the steel rod into the earth. Some places stopped it after 4 inches. Others allowed 6. A few went deeper. She recorded everything: depth, resistance, moisture, the color of the soil, even the direction of the prevailing wind across each slope. At night, she sat beside a lantern and transferred the information onto a hand-drawn map. Lines appeared first, then symbols, then patterns. The dead rise slowly transformed into something very different. Not a failed piece of land, a puzzle. One afternoon, Amos rode out again. He watched her drive the probe into the ground and write another note, then another, and another. For several minutes, he said nothing. Finally, he pointed toward the growing map spread across a crate beside her wagon. "Your grandmother spent 30 years on this ridge," he said. "She never measured 60 holes in the dirt." Keturah looked at the probe marks scattered across the hillside. "No," she replied quietly. "She only had one lifetime." Amos stared at her, as though the answer confirmed every suspicion he carried. By the time he rode away, he was telling people in town that the widow had gone strange. Meanwhile, Keturah continued filling page after page with pencil marks. The wind erased footprints. Rain washed away tracks. But the map kept growing, and with every new measurement, the ridge revealed a little more of what it had been hiding. The measurements continued. So did the rumors. By December, word of the widow and her strange map had spread beyond the neighboring farms. It eventually reached Deputy Agricultural Agent Warren Pike, a county official responsible for advising homesteaders on crops, soil conditions, and land productivity. One gray afternoon, he rode out to Coyote Drawridge, carrying a leather satchel filled with county reports. Keturah was kneeling beside another probe hole when he arrived. Warren studied the ridge for several moments before speaking. "The county has records going back years," he said. "Alkali soil like this has defeated wheat, oats, barley, and corn." He opened his satchel and pulled out several folded sheets. "The numbers are clear. Winter rye won't solve alkali." The wind pushed across the hillside between them. Keturah listened without interrupting. Warren continued explaining rainfall averages, crop failures, and soil classifications recorded by men who had spent decades studying the region. When he finally finished, she looked toward one of the shallow excavation pits she had opened weeks earlier. Then she asked a single question: "Have you ever dug below the white layer?" The county official did not answer immediately. His eyes shifted toward the exposed soil, toward the darker earth beneath the alkali crust. For a moment, neither spoke. The reports in Warren Pike's satchel carried years of county knowledge. The pit in front of him carried something else. Evidence. And for the first time, the certainty in his voice seemed just a little less certain. The first snow arrived 3 days earlier than expected. Not much. Just a thin white dusting that settled in the hollows and along the windbreaks before melting under the afternoon sun. Keturah watched it from the ridge. Then she opened Nathaniel Crow's notebook and compared the snow pattern to the map she had spent months building. The next morning, she finally began planting. The townspeople expected her to scatter seed across the entire 27 acres. That was how most struggling homesteaders worked. Plant everything. Hope for rain. Pray for mercy. Keturah did neither. She carried a canvas sack of winter rye across the hillside and planted only where her markers told her to plant. Long, narrow corridors. Nothing more. Nothing less. From a distance, the field looked unfinished. Large sections remained untouched. Bare earth stretched between the planted strips. Some people passing on the county road assumed she had run out of seed halfway through the job. Others decided the widow could not afford enough grain to sow properly. Neither explanation was correct. Every row followed a purpose, followed the map. The lines ran across the ridge at angles that looked strange to anyone unfamiliar with winter wind. They were positioned to catch drifting snow instead of shedding it. When storms arrived, snow would gather along those corridors and slowly release moisture into the ground during spring thaw. The work progressed steadily. Stake, measure, sow, cover, move forward, again and again. The prairie wind tugged at her coat while rye seed disappeared into the soil one handful at a time. People saw empty ground and assumed failure. Keturah saw future snowdrifts. People saw missing rows and assumed poverty. Keturah saw hidden moisture. By the time the last sack was empty, the ridge looked less like a field than a carefully laid trap. Now only one thing remained. Nature had to decide whether the plan deserved to survive. Winter arrived without ceremony. 1 week the prairie was brown. The next, it was white. Snow swept across Coyote Draw Ridge in long moving sheets, driven by winds strong enough to strip exposed ground bare and pile drifts shoulder-high against a fence line only a few hundred yards away. This was the season Keturah had been waiting for. While most people stayed close to their stoves, she walked the ridge, again and again, sometimes before sunrise, sometimes after storms. Her boots left the only tracks on the frozen hillside. She studied where snow gathered, where it disappeared, where the wind carved the surface clean, and where deep drifts settled exactly where Nathaniel Crow's notes suggested they might. Each observation went into the notebook. Snow depth, wind direction, drift length. Days later, when brief thaws softened the surface, she returned to watch where meltwater disappeared into the ground and where it simply ran away. Nature was speaking. Not with words, with patterns. Most people never noticed. Keturah wrote down every one. Meanwhile, the county reached its own conclusion. The rye had vanished beneath snow and ice. Nothing green remained visible. From the road, the ridge looked no different than it had 20 years earlier. Dead, finished, defeated. More than one person remarked that spring would reveal what everyone already knew. The crop was gone. The widow had wasted another season. The wind seemed to agree. It screamed across the ridge night after night, erasing tracks, burying markers, testing every assumption she had made. And somewhere beneath the frozen surface, unseen by anyone, the future of the harvest waited for judgment. Spring arrived slowly across eastern Colorado. First came the thaw, then came the green. By late March, thin rows of rye began appearing across the dead rise. One line, then another, then dozens more. The pale hillside that had looked lifeless all winter suddenly carried streaks of living color. People noticed. Wagons slowed on the county road. Neighbors stopped to stare. Even Warren Pike rode past twice in the same week. For the first time, it appeared that Keturah might have seen something everyone else had missed. Then, April arrived, and the color began to change. Not everywhere, just enough to cause concern. The deep green blades turned pale. Pale became yellow. Yellow became brittle. Entire sections of rye stopped growing. Some plants collapsed completely. Each morning seemed worse than the one before. By the second week, patches of dead rye were visible from the road. Amos Hale returned soon afterward. He stood beside his horse and looked across the field for a long time. Then he nodded once. Not with satisfaction, with certainty. "I told you so." The words lingered after he left. For the first time in months, Keturah did not walk the ridge before sunset. She sat alone on the small porch outside her cabin, watching the wind move through the failing crop. The notebook rested beside her untouched. The prairie seemed larger that evening. The silence seemed heavier. Nature had not yet delivered its final judgment, but it was beginning to look as though the county had been right all along. When darkness finally settled over the ridge, the yellowing rows remained where they were, waiting. The next morning, before sunrise, Keturah picked up Nathaniel Crow's notebook, took a shovel from the wall, and walked back into the field. Keturah did not pull the yellow rye and call it failure. She dug, one plant at a time. She lifted the roots carefully, shook loose the soil, and laid each sample on a strip of burlap beside the furrow. Healthy plants on one side, weak plants on the other, dead plants in a third row. For 3 days, she repeated the same work until the pattern became too clear to ignore. The worst rye had not died on the hardest ground. It had died on the flattest ground. The plants growing along the slight slopes were thin but alive. The plants in the shallow basins had yellowed first. That changed the question. The seed was not the problem. The rye was not the problem. Even the ridge itself was not the problem. Keturah dug deeper into one of the dead patches. Several inches below the surface, she found the pale alkali crust had been pulled downward by spring water. The soil was damp. Too damp. The water had carried the white salts down into the root zone, then trapped them there. She opened Crow's notebook with muddy fingers and found the line she had marked weeks earlier. Dead soil seldom dies from lacking something. It often dies from holding too much. The words no longer felt like theory. They felt like a warning she had nearly missed. The field hadn't failed. It was speaking, and this time she understood the language. Before the sun set, Keturah took up her shovel and decisively cut the first drainage lines into the earth. The solution didn't look impressive. Then again, worthwhile work on the frontier rarely did. For weeks, Keturah labored across the hillside armed with nothing but a shovel, a measuring stick, and Nathaniel Crow's notebook tucked inside her coat. She cut trench after trench by hand, shallow and narrow, barely a hand's depth. They were precisely calculated to siphon the stagnant, alkali-heavy water away from the low spots without stealing vital moisture from the rye. The work stretched across hundreds of feet of ground. From a distance, the changes were almost invisible. No new buildings, no expensive equipment, no dramatic transformation, only fresh lines cut into the soil. The shovel handle slowly polished where her hands gripped it. The skin across her palms split open more than once. By the end of each day, dried blood mixed with dust along her fingers. Still, she kept digging. One afternoon, Elias Mercer, the town merchant who controlled much of the area's winter credit and seed trade, stopped beside the field. He watched her work for several minutes before speaking. What happens if the crop dies anyway? The question carried more weight than it seemed. Failure cost money, cost food, cost winters. Keturah rested both hands on the shovel and looked across the yellowing rye. Then I'll know why it died.
To know what happened next, like this video and subscribe our page and watch the full story. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now?